Welcome back to Media 7, where our topic is the media and climate change. Britain's Guardian newspaper has a clear editorial line on climate change. It even orchestrated the global editorial through which dozens of newspapers urged action at the Copenhagen summit last year. And no media organisation covered the contents of the so-called ClimateGate emails as extensively as the Guardian did. The paper's environment editor, James Randerson, hired veteran science journalist Fred Pearce to read and review the emails. Pearce wrote 28,000 words in all. James Randerson joins me now from London. James, how did the news media do in general on this story?
I don't think generally the media has acquitted itself particularly well on this because there was too much uncritical reporting and selective quoting from the emails, all of those phrases like hide the decline and use a trick, and all of that was just bogus. All of that didn't mean what it appeared to mean, and it didn't mean what a lot of the bloggers said it meant, and the media kind of lapped it up without really investigating the emails. That's why we thought it was important to put a significant amount of resources in and find out what they really said and what the context means. So yeah, I don't think the media has done very well on this one.
What conclusions can be drawn from your reporting?
Well, I think the most important conclusion that comes out of it is, and I think you can only really say this if you've looked at the emails properly, is that there is no evidence for a sort of a deliberate cover-up, a deliberate attempt by the scientists to manipulate the data to show that warming is happening when it's not. That just simply isn't there. And that's very, very clear from the emails. So having said that, we were very critical in some of that reporting. And in particular, I think what emerges about the culture of climate science is in some way a little bit disturbing and needs definitely to be addressed. I think it's understandable because this comes from, it's a sort of defensiveness amongst the climate scientists, I think, that comes from years and years of being bombarded with criticism and vitriol, actually, in many cases. There's a real sense of sort of, well, in places, a sort of tribalism, a sort of circling of the wagons, and a deflection of criticism, and in particular, in many places they were trying to stop people having access to the data, I think, or at least they certainly were talking in that way.
Is complete openness a solution here?
I think so. I think complete openness would be a really useful thing that could come out of this. I mean, in some cases, the climate scientists argued with complete validity that in places they just simply weren't allowed to release the data because it wasn't their data. But there is a suspicion that in places they just didn't want to, because some of the people who were making those Freedom of Information Act requests were critics, often bloggers, amateurs, who they really didn't rate as people who were, peers, scientific peers. And so I think they felt, well, who are you to have my data and just pick holes in it? But actually, I think it would be healthy for the science, and it would certainly neuter all of this criticism if when everything is published, all of the data are put out there, not just the sort of the raw data, but the intermediate steps that allow you to get from that to the conclusions. Get it all out there. It can't do any harm.
Has the release of the emails changed the way climate science is reported in the media?
Yes, I think that. I think there's been a certain amount of public confusion generated by them. I think that people within newsrooms, there's now an appetite within newsrooms to find and look for stories that are sort of knocking climate science. It looks, particularly, strangely, I would almost kind of lump it in with the MP's expenses scandal that's been going on in this country, that there is a general feeling of people wanting to kind of knock authority. This maybe sort of feeds into that mood slightly.
Has this become as much about communications as science? Does climate science need a hero?
That's an interesting way of putting it, quite possibly. It is definitely about communication. The difficult bit is predicting the impacts. Modelling the climate, it's a very complex system. But I think you sort of need to turn the argument around and say to those people who are sceptical of the science, okay, so we know CO2 warms the atmosphere, and we've been pumping trillions of tons of the stuff into the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, are you really confident that's not going to change the climate? I mean, really? You think a kind of insurance-based approach of like, well, maybe we should do something about this, even though there are always going to be uncertainties. There is never going to be a point where every scientist will come over and say, right, we're definitely sure, we know what's going to happen. Science just isn't like that. So, we're always going to have to take decisions based on a kind of balance of risks. And when you've got a significant, a massive majority in the climate science community saying we have a problem here and we have to prepare for it and we have to do something about it, we have to change the way we get our energy, then I think it would be prudent to listen to them, really.
James Randerson, thank you. I'm joined now by a journalist whose job it is to communicate ideas of sustainability. Good magazine editor Annabelle McAleer. Welcome, Annabelle.
Hi.
You edit a magazine about sustainability, as I said. Are you seeing green fatigue? People are talking about that this year.
Yeah, I don't think there's green fatigue around environmental stories in general, but I think specifically around climate change there is a little bit of fatigue. I think climate change stories in the mainstream kind of daily media are really tending to focus on this ongoing question of debate, the ethics of science, whether UN and IPCC processes are working, the finer details of what we still don't understand about climate change. And all that, to me, that's the really kind of boring side of climate change. It's really complicated, and we've been talking about it for a long time. And I think there are a whole lot of more interesting stories to tell when you get past that.
So what's a sexy climate change story look like?
Well, basically, I mean, every product in the world that exists is being redesigned and re-engineered to have a lower carbon footprint, have a lower impact in manufacturing and disposal even. We've got a whole new world economy building up around carbon. We've got amazing technological leaps that are being made, and I think inspiring people. And there's this whole kind of global movement, I suppose, towards people wanting to live more sustainably.
There are upbeat science stories that can be told around this.
Oh yeah, there's some really interesting stories that I think people do want to hear.
So why don't we see them?
I don't know, I feel like the media is just stuck in this kind of conflict debate, which I guess is familiar territory because it applies to lots of other stories.
Do you think it's also the case, perhaps, that climate change in particular and sustainability as a concept in general isn't quite as trendy as it was 2 or 3 years ago? It was fashionable then, wasn't it?
I think there was almost a worry that it was fashionable, that it had become too popular, therefore it was going to become unpopular. And I think what's happened now is that it's actually just becoming more and more mainstream. So maybe we're hearing less and less about the kind of trend because it's just, everyone's becoming concerned, it seems like everyone's got a veggie patch and, everyone's composting, and it's just become much more mainstream. But I think what we're seeing is actually just a real shift in attitudes. Do
you think people like to be shown something practical they can do? I wonder whether there's a sense of hopelessness about climate change because it is such a vast concept.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and that's what kind of our brief is for the magazine, is to be kind of consistently optimistic and action-oriented. And, I read a lot of environmental news and it's really depressing. Sometimes I just have to have a week off of reading it because it's, it can really get you down. And so no one would buy a magazine that was full of those stories because, who wants to read a magazine and be really depressed? So, yeah, I definitely think people are wanting to change the way that they live. They are seeing these terrible environmental stories and are really aware that humans are having this really negative effect on the planet. And they don't want to be part of the problem anymore. They want to be part of solutions, even if those solutions are just really small in their own family. They want to feel like they're not contributing anymore to this. But by the same
token, your readers might feel like that, but I'm not sure that Leighton Smith's listeners feel that way.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people yet to reach.
Yeah, there is. It hasn't spread, through the entire population yet. But I think that's the thing with any kind of change and shift in mindset, is it happens really slowly.
Do you think the New Zealand media handle these stories well in general. Obviously, you know, as you say, they seem to be stuck in conflict mode over climate change. And we're never going to be, on the other hand, be the Guardian with a vast environment website.
Yeah,
how are we doing?
We're living in a world where the climate is changing, and that's a factor. And it shouldn't be kind of ghettoed into its own little section of the paper. You know, the overseas you see coverage of the volcanic eruption in Iceland, and you know you'll see it mentioned, well, is this going to cool the planet? Because Pinatubo did for like a year. And so, you know, you're having journalists ask questions like, you know, is there enough volcanic ash in the atmosphere to cool it? Will there be more volcanic eruptions because of climate change as glaciers melt and the weight lifts off volcanoes? Some scientists are saying that there will be. When the Australian bushfires happened last year, overseas media were asking, were they exacerbated by climate change? But we didn't see New Zealand media asking those questions.
Well, I think we all long for the day when journalists are as well versed in science as they are in economics.
Yeah.
Annabelle McAleer, thank you. Thanks also to Professor Sir Peter Gluckman and Dr. James Randerson of The Guardian, and as ever, to you for joining us. That's our show for this week. We've posted links to topics we've covered in the Media 7 blog, and you can join us for more Media 7 at the same time next week. Until then, goodbye.